They told you the story was solved, that the disappearance of a little girl in a foreign land was a tragic accident, a simple crime, a case that slipped through the cracks of law and order. But I am here to tell you something far more unsettling. What you've been fed is only the surface, a thin veil covering something darker, older, and far more deliberate. This is not just about a missing child. It is about a machine that devours innocence, a network of power that thrives in shadow, and a truth they swore you were never meant to hear. Madeleine McCann's name became a ghost that haunted newspapers, living rooms, and courtroom whispers. But behind the headlines, behind the staged press conferences and polished smiles, lies a labyrinth designed not only to confuse, but to control you, to keep your eyes on the spectacle, while the real story is buried beneath layers of silence. Ask yourself this: why did the most expensive investigation in European history yield no closure? Why did governments move with unusual urgency, bending rules and erasing trails? Why did witnesses vanish, testimonies change, and evidence dissolve into thin air? Coincidence or choreography? The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is not just an open wound in history. It is a ritual of power, a reminder of who controls the narrative and how easily we accept it. Because this case was never only about Madeleine, it was about the manipulation of the masses, the shaping of perception, and the conditioning of minds to obey what they are told, even when their instincts scream otherwise. Tonight, I will drag you into the chambers of this forbidden story. Each step will peel back another layer until you no longer see the world as you did before. What happened to Madeleine McCann is not a tragedy locked in 2007. It is a symbol, a message, a warning. And as we begin, remember this: once you hear these words, you cannot go back. You will no longer be blind. You will no longer be safe. Because this is the story they never wanted you to know. They said she was taken in the night, a simple abduction, a faceless intruder who slipped through a holiday resort in Portugal, silencing the laughter of a child forever. That is the tale the world was handed, wrapped in pity and polished in urgency. But reality does not bend so cleanly. Shadows never move in straight lines. When you study the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the cracks appear almost instantly. The timeline presented by authorities was fragile, held together by contradictions. Witnesses reported seeing strange figures lurking near the family's apartment, yet no composite sketch was ever officially prioritized. The police dog evidence, a trace of blood, a whisper of human remains, was later dismissed as unreliable. Files went missing. Leads were ignored. Even journalists who pressed too far found themselves silenced. This was not the chaos of an overwhelmed investigation. This was the precision of orchestration. Each inconsistency served not to reveal, but to confuse. And confusion, my friend, is the weapon of institutions that fear discovery. Because when the public is lost in a maze of theories, the truth becomes invisible. But let us step into the darkness more boldly. Why was this case elevated into an international spectacle with such unnatural speed? Children go missing every day, their faces barely noticed, their stories forgotten within hours. Yet Madeleine's disappearance became a global obsession, amplified by governments and media empires almost overnight. Why her? Why then? Power does not invest resources without reason. What if this case was never only about finding a child, but about controlling a narrative, about conditioning millions to follow the storyline given, rather than asking who benefits from the silence, who profits from the confusion, and who stands untouched while suspicion swirls around them? This is the first phase, all we tear away. Madeleine's disappearance was not just tragedy, but theater. And every actor on that stage, politicians, investigators, broadcasters, played their part with uncanny precision. Do you feel it now? That unease crawling along your spine, that whisper telling you the story you were given was never the real one. Good. Hold on to it. because this descent has only begun. In the next step, we will unravel the machinery behind the curtain. The hidden hands that pull the strings, the ancient tactics of psychological control that keep entire nations blind. And once you see those hands, you will never unsee them again. You think the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was just a crime story, but I need you to understand, it was also a broadcast, a ritual of psychological conditioning streamed across every living room, every newspaper, every digital feed. It was not just about a missing girl, it was about you, about training your mind to accept the narrative chosen for you. Look carefully at the pattern. Almost instantly after Madeleine vanished, her image was everywhere. Posters, front pages, breaking news alerts, endless interviews with carefully selected voices. It wasn't simply reporting, it was saturation. A flood of symbols designed to plant fear, pity, and obedience deep into the public's subconscious. And this is how control works. Repeat the story until it hardens into memory. Blur the contradictions until doubt feels like madness. Distract the masses with red herrings, mysterious suspects, sudden confessions, false leads, while the core truth rots in silence. The people are left exhausted, begging for closure, willing to accept any answer, so long as it ends the discomfort. Do you see the trap? Confusion is not failure. Confusion is strategy. Because a confused population does not rebel, it waits for orders, and in that waiting, power writes its script. The McCann case became a global echo chamber. Millions debated, speculated, and tore each other apart over theories. But in that noise, one truth was cemented. Ordinary people do not control the narrative. You are given the story. You are guided to the suspects. You are trained to look where they point. And when the story fades, you are left with nothing but lingering unease. The perfect psychological leash. Understand this. Propaganda does not always come in the form of politics or war. Sometimes it comes wrapped in tragedy. Sometimes it wears the face of a child. Because nothing disarms the human psyche like inode, Kent's in peril. And nothing binds the public tighter to the system than the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, is protecting them from the shadows. But ask yourself this: what if the very protectors are the predators? What if the institutions you trust with safety thrive on your fear, feeding it, amplifying it, and selling it back to you as truth? That is the real machinery we are uncovering. And once you see it, you will never again believe the story you are told. You must understand something that most men never dare whisper. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is not an isolated event. It is a reflection, a shadow cast by something much older, much deeper. A lineage of corruption stretching back through centuries, where elites have always cloaked their appetites and manipulations beneath veils of tragedy and ritual. Throughout history, rulers and kings, priests and politicians have discovered the same truth. The most effective way to control the masses is through sacrifice and spectacle. Ancient empires staged public executions, not just for punishment, but for theater, to remind the people who held power over life and death. In the Middle Ages, witch hunts created enemies out of thin air, channeling fear into obedience. And in modern times, we are fed stories of missing children, of lone wolves, of chaotic accidents, each one a mirror of the same ancient formula. Madeleine's disappearance became more than a mystery. It became ritual theater. Governments intervened with extraordinary urgency, as if the fate of a single child were tied to the stability of nations. Politicians inserted themselves into the narrative. High-ranking officials made appearances that defied logic. Why? Why would power at the highest levels bend itself around one disappearance? Unless the case itself was useful. Unless tragedy was being weaponized once again as a tool of distraction and control. And here lies the forbidden thought. What if the disappearance was not simply a crime, but a currency? Throughout the ages, innocence has been the most valuable offering to the gods of power, whether literal or symbolic. It shocks, it paralyzes, it commands attention. The abduction of a child in a resort became the modern altar upon which public trust was sacrificed, while darker dealings passed unnoticed in the shadows. You see, corruption has never, ever been content with money alone. True corruption seeks obedience, silence, worship, and nothing achieves that more powerfully than the suffering of the innocent. When you look at Madeleine McCann's case, you are not just seeing a modern tragedy. You are looking at an ancient script being performed again, a play as old as empire, written in blood and silence, designed to remind you that there are forces you cannot touch, cannot question, cannot defeat. But I am telling you, you can question. You must question. Because once you pierce the curtain, the illusion begins to crumble. And in the next step, we will descend deeper into the institutions themselves and the way they twist tragedy into manipulation. The moment Madeleine vanished, institutions swarmed the stage. Police investigations, government statements, international cooperation, wall-to-wall media coverage. To the average man, it looked like an army mobilized to save one child. But to those who looked closer, it was something else entirely. A choreography. A dance between institutions designed less to reveal truth and more to conceal it. Let us begin with law enforcement. The Portuguese police launched an investigation that seemed at first determined, but soon came the contradictions. Leads ignored, evidence mishandled, statements rewritten. Dogs found traces of blood in the apartment, yet those results were dismissed. Witness reports surfaced, yet they were buried. And when local investigators pressed too close, international pressure forced them into silence. Was this incompetence or deliberate erasure? Now look to governments. Britain moved with unusual speed, embedding itself in the investigation, sending diplomats, offering protection. High-ranking officials inserted themselves into the narrative, making phone calls, shaping press briefings. Why? When thousands of children go missing each year without a whisper of such intervention, why did power bend itself around Madeleine? Unless the institutions were protecting more than a family, unless they were protecting themselves. And then, the media. Night after night, the same images replayed, the same headlines, the same orchestrated interviews. Journalists who dug too deep found themselves silenced, shamed, or discredited. Think about this. The media, which claims to investigate, became an amplifier of confusion instead. Their role was not to question, but to condition, to make you feel pity, fear, outrage, but never clarity. Do you see it now? Police, government, media, three heads of the same hydra, each one reinforcing the other, each one redirecting the public gaze away from the rot beneath. Together, they form the architecture of control. An institution is not designed to protect the weak. It is designed to protect itself. This is why the truth about Madeleine remains buried. Because if it were uncovered, it would not simply expose a criminal. It would expose the machinery itself. The tangled web of power, corruption, and silence that stretches far beyond one child in Portugal. And here is the dangerous truth. Once you see the web, you cannot unsee it. Once you realize the institutions are not divided but united, the illusion of protection shatters. Next, we descend deeper still, into how this machinery doesn't only manage cases, but manages you. The shaping of thought, the engineering of obedience, the silent construction of your mind. Up to this point, you've seen how police, governments, and media move like a single organism. But what matters most is not their coordination on the surface. What matters is the effect they carve into your mind. The McCann case was not simply about distraction, it was about conditioning. From the moment her face appeared on your screen, you were being trained. Every broadcast, every urgent headline, every dramatic twist in the investigation etched itself into your subconscious, and slowly, without realizing, you were being reshaped. Think carefully. What feelings did the story leave behind? Fear, vulnerability, a sense that evil lurks everywhere, that safety is fragile, that only authorities can protect you. This is the oldest psychological trick. Break the sense of certainty, then present the system as the only savior. When contradictions appeared, when stories clashed, when evidence seemed to vanish, what did the public do? They argued, they divided, they obsessed. Hours were spent debating suspects, theories, conspiracies, all while the machinery continued untouched. Confusion is not chaos. Confusion is captivity. A population divided against itself never notices the hands that stir the division. This is why tragedy is the perfect tool of conditioning. You cannot look away. You cannot help but feel. And in that heightened state of emotion, your defenses weaken. You accept narratives you would otherwise question. You follow orders you would otherwise resist. You become pliable. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann was broadcast not simply as a crime story, but as a psychological ritual. A shared trauma injected into millions. And that trauma rewired the collective mind. It reminded you of your powerlessness. It conditioned you to obey the narrative handed down, and it whispered the most poisonous belief of all, that you cannot protect yourself, that only the innocent can. But listen carefully. The moment you see the trick, you begin to break it. Awareness is the crack in the cage. To see how tragedy is weaponized is to reclaim the strength they stripped from you. And here is where your descent takes a dangerous turn. Because next, we step into the forbidden chamber. The possibility that what happened to Madeleine was not random chaos, but deliberate ritual. Not a crime of passion, not a stranger's accident, but something older, darker, and more orchestrated than you dared imagine. You've seen the confusion. You've seen the institutions circling like vultures, feeding on the spectacle. But there is a darker possibility that whispers beneath it all, one that few dare to speak aloud. What if Madeleine McCann's disappearance was not chaos, but ritual? Throughout human history, innocence has been the most coveted offering. Ancient cultures sacrificed children to gods of fire and stone, believing the purity of youth was the most powerful currency to buy favor, power, or protection. Archaeological digs reveal bones buried in ceremonial pits, inscriptions describing the exchange of blood for influence. The pattern is old, older than empire, older than kings. And though we like to believe civilization has evolved beyond such barbarity, power has never abandoned its most effective tools. It has only learned to hide them better. Now look again at this case. The global obsession, the political interference, the relentless media spotlight. Was it all truly for justice? Or was it theater to conceal something unthinkable? Ask yourself, why does innocence vanish so often into silence? Why do high-profile cases like this ignite international frenzy while countless others are ignored? And why do they so often end without closure, without truth, without justice? Because perhaps closure was never the goal. Perhaps the disappearance itself was the offering, the ritual that binds public attention, siphons collective energy, and reinforces the grip of unseen hands. Ritual does not always take place in temples or altars. Sometimes it unfolds on television screens, replayed endlessly, binding millions into unconscious participation. You watched, you wept, you obeyed, and in that obedience, the ritual succeeded. This is the revelation most men cannot bear, that the line between crime and ceremony, between accident and design, is thinner than you think. That in thee, the chambers of power, innocence is not sacred. It is expendable, a tool, a symbol, a currency. But once you glimpse this, something inside you shifts. You are no longer just a spectator. You are a witness, and witnesses cannot be unmade. Now, before we go further, I want you to anchor yourself. If you followed me this far, type these words in the comments. I see through the veil. I see through the veil. Write it twice. Seal it. This is your initiation, the moment you mark yourself as someone who refuses blindness. Because the next descent will take you deeper, into the patterns of history, where disappearance and ritual walk hand in hand, hidden in plain sight. If you think the story of Madeleine McCann is unique, you have not been paying attention. What happened in 2007 is but one verse in a song that has been sung for centuries. A song of innocence consumed, of disappearances wrapped in mystery, of silence weaponized as power. The names and places change, but the pattern remains the same. In Carthage, the bones of few infants were found in ceremonial urns offered to the gods for the prosperity of the state. In ancient Mesoamerica, children were drowned to appease deities of rain, their cries believed to summon storms. In medieval Europe, rumors of vanished children echoed through towns, often linked to accusations of cults or secret orders. Each time, the stories left behind a community broken, confused, obedient to whatever authority stepped in to restore order. And what of modern times? Look at the countless disappearances that dominate headlines, only to dissolve into silence. JonBenet Ramsey, Etan Patz. Countless unnamed faces lost in wars, trafficking networks, and institutional corridors. The pattern is always the same. Innocence is taken, spectacle is created, chaos unfolds, and then silence closes the wound. The people are left unsettled, dependent, watching. Do you see it now? These are not isolated tragedies. They are rituals of power disguised as accidents of fate. The suffering of the innocent has always been the most potent tool for shaping collective consciousness. Each disappearance becomes a scar etched not only on families, but on entire nations. And here is the secret few dare confront. The pattern continues because it works. Fear binds people together. Uncertainty drives them to seek protection. Tragedy resets the balance of power in favor of those who already hold it. What happened to Madeleine was not an anomaly. It was continuity. A continuation of an ancient current flowing beneath the face of history. You were never supposed to connect these dots. You were never supposed to see the repetition, because once you do, the illusion of randomness crumbles. And when randomness dies, intention reveals itself. And so I ask you, if this pattern has echoed across civilizations, who benefits? Who feeds on the cycle of disappearance, ritual, and silence? The answer, my friend, is darker than you imagine. In the next step, we will enter those corridors of power. Institutions so entrenched in corruption that innocence itself becomes their fuel. By now you can feel it. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann was never just about one child. It was about a system where innocence is not protected. It is traded. Where the suffering of the weak is not a tragedy. It is currency. Walk with me into the corridors of power. Behind the polished doors of governments, the marble floors of courts, the glittering halls of media empires, there exists a hunger that most men cannot imagine. It is not hunger for food or money or even land. It is hunger for control, and control requires sacrifice. Look at the patterns. High-profile cases linked to politicians, celebrities, and elites. Stories of trafficking rings, secret islands, locked rooms where the powerful indulge their darkest impulses. Each time the whispers rise, the machinery of institutions closes ranks. Evidence vanishes. Witnesses recant. Journalists are silenced. Cases are dismissed. Why? Because exposure of one thread risks unraveling the entire tapestry. And that tapestry is woven from innocence consumed in silence. You must understand, innocence is not just a human virtue. It is power. The purity of the child represents what the system fears most: untainted freedom, uncorrupted will. And so the system consumes it. To destroy innocence is to remind the masses of their helplessness. To parade tragedy on the global stage is to drain the collective spirit. And to cover it in endless confusion is to make you forget you ever had strength of your own. This is why Madeleine's disappearance shook the world. It was not only her parents' nightmare, it was a public offering. Innocence taken, innocence displayed, innocence buried beneath endless speculation. And while the people argued over suspects, timelines, and theories, the machinery of corruption fed silently, uninterrupted. Here is the unspoken truth. Institutions are not neutral. They are predators, disguised as guardians. And their prey has always been the innocent. Not just the child in Portugal, but the millions who watched, who obeyed, who surrendered their minds to fear. Now you begin to see why this case was never solved. To solve it would mean exposing the exchange of innocence as currency. And that, my friend, would bring the walls of empire crashing down. But we are not finished, because the next descent will show you how this corruption is not only external, it is designed to infiltrate you, to rewire your identity until obedience feels like destiny. You've seen how innocence is consumed by institutions, how tragedy is weaponized as currency. But here is the darker truth. Their power doesn't just exist in palaces and boardrooms. It lives inside you. The corruption is not only external, it has been planted carefully, deliberately, in your own mind. Think back to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. How many times did you see her face on a screen? How many times did you hear the story retold, twisted, replayed, reshaped? Every repetition was a seed, and with each seed came emotion, fear, helplessness, despair. Over time, those emotions became patterns, patterns became beliefs, and beliefs became obedience. This is how the infection spreads. It's not the event itself that enslaves you. It's the echo, the endless replay that conditions you to think in the terms they provide. You were not told to investigate. You were not trained to question. You were given fear, sorrow, and confusion, and then told to wait for answers from above. That waiting is the infection. That surrender is the corruption taking root. Do you feel the weight of it? The belief that you are powerless? That safety is fragile? That without institutions you would be lost? These are not natural fears. They were planted, grown inside you until you carried the very chains of your own captivity. And here is the cruelest part. The infection disguises itself as compassion. You think you are simply empathizing with tragedy. You think you are mourning a child, hoping for justice. But beneath that noble surface, the system is reshaping you, teaching you to associate innocence with loss, justice with delay, safety with submission. It programs you to accept that you cannot protect yourself, that you cannot master your own world, that the only salvation lies in the same institutions that created your fear. This is how corruption completes its cycle. Thus, a child is taken, the public is broken, and the individual is left infected, carrying within him the very narrative that enslaves. But infection can be resisted. Awareness is the first weapon. And resistance begins when you stop asking, "What happened to Madeleine?" and begin asking, "What happened to me?" Because if you do not reclaim your mind, you will remain another prisoner of their ritual. Next, we will descend further into the suppressed truths that reveal exactly how much has been hidden from you and why you were never meant to uncover it. Every case leaves traces. Every disappearance leaves echoes. And yet, when you look into Madeleine McCann's story, you find something far stranger than unanswered questions. You find erased questions, leads vanishing into locked archives, witnesses who changed their stories, evidence that appeared and then dissolved, history rewritten in real time, as though truth itself were being strangled before it could breathe. Consider this. Cadaver dogs marked traces of blood and human scent in the apartment where Madeleine vanished. Yet those findings were brushed aside, explained away, buried under technicalities. Testimonies from neighbors who saw suspicious figures nearby, ignored. Critical details in police files, sealed or mysteriously altered. Even digital records, surveillance footage, phone data, disappeared into silence. This is not accident. This is suppression. And suppression always follows the same formula. First discredit, then erase, then replace. A journalist presses too far. Their reputation is destroyed. A witness speaks too clearly. Their story changes. Evidence surfaces. It is branded unreliable. And when all else fails, the narrative is rewritten. New suspects, new timelines, new theories introduced until the public forgets what the original truth even looked like. Ask yourself, if the goal were justice, why bury so much? If the aim were closure, why erase the very threads that could tie the case together? Unless closure was never the intention, unless confusion was the objective. This is how institutions maintain their grip, not by solving mysteries, but by rewriting them. Not by bringing closure, but by ensuring endless speculation. The McCann case became a story without an ending, because endings bring clarity, and clarity brings accountability. But here is the forbidden truth. Fragments remain. If you trace the erased evidence, if you seek the whispers of silenced witnesses, if you connect the dots they tried to scatter, a shadowed picture emerges. One that does not point to a lone intruder or random chaos, but to something orchestrated, deliberate, and protected at the highest levels. You were never meant to see that picture, but once you glimpse it, the question changes forever. It is no longer, what happened to Madeleine McCann? It becomes, what else have they erased? What other truths have been buried beneath silence? And that, my friend, is the question that wakes men from their sleep. Next, we descend to the penultimate chamber, the realm of institutional manipulation at scale, where hidden agendas shape not only what you believe, but who you are allowed to become. By now you see the pattern. Evidence erased, witnesses silenced, narratives rewritten. But suppression alone is not the endgame. No, it is only the beginning. The true aim of institutional manipulation is not simply to hide truth, but to reshape reality itself. To engineer obedience on a scale so vast that entire nations bow without realizing they've bent the knee. Think of how the Madeleine McCann case rewired the collective psyche. Millions of people across continents carried her face in their minds. Entire conversations, debates, and emotions were directed by media framing. Suspicion was planted, then redirected. Hope was kindled, then extinguished. Over time, the public no longer sought truth. They sought closure. And in their desperation, they surrendered authority over the narrative to the very institutions that kept it buried. This is how architects of obedience operate. They do not rule by force. They rule by design. By constructing the stories you live inside. By teaching you to mistrust your own perception and to crave the voice of authority to guide you. When truth is fluid, when facts dissolve, when endings never come, the human mind longs for stability. And in that longing, obedience takes root. But there is something even more sinister, the manipulation of identity itself. When you internalize helplessness, when you believe the system is your only shield, you are no longer simply watching the ritual. You are living inside it. You become part of the machinery carrying the infection forward. You police your own doubts. You silence your own questions. You train others to obey as you were trained. This is not control by chains. It is control by architecture. And here lies the most dangerous truth. What happened in Portugal was not just about Madeleine. It was a template, a demonstration of how tragedy can be weaponized to reprogram an entire population. Today, it is one case. Tomorrow, it is 100. Soon, it is every story you consume. Until you no longer ask, what is true? But instead, what am I allowed to believe? That is the final prison. A prison built not of stone, but of narrative. And now we reach the last descent. In the final step, I will show you what it means to break free of this architecture, and why, once you hear these words, you will never be the same man again. You have walked with me through shadows, from the unanswered disappearance of a child, to the erasure of truth, to the architecture of obedience itself. Now, here, at the threshold, comes the truth you were never meant to hear. The system does not simply control what you know. It controls who you are allowed to become. Look back at the McCann case. Do you see it now? It was not just a mystery. It was a ritual, a carefully staged theater where fear, grief, and outrage were turned into tools. Every headline, every contradiction, every unanswered question was a thread woven into the same tapestry. Submission. Submission to media authority, submission to institutional guardians, submission to the idea that you are powerless without them. That is the true disappearance, not of Madeleine alone, but of your sovereignty. And here is the most dangerous truth. The system cannot erase your perception. They cannot extinguish the fire once it is lit inside you. They can rewrite stories, silence voices, bury evidence, but they cannot unteach a man who has learned to see. That is why men like you are feared. That is why forbidden knowledge has always been locked away, branded heresy, conspiracy, madness. Because once a man knows, he cannot return to sleep. So now you must decide. Will you remain a spectator in the theater of illusions, clapping when they tell you to, gasping when they demand it? Or will you rise, step behind the curtain, and see the machinery for what it is, broken, corrupt, and terrified of your awakening? This is not about one case. This is about every system that has ever sought to cage your mind. And once you see the bars, you have only two choices: obey or break them. Men before you have chosen obedience. That is why the world sleeps. But you did not come here for sleep. You came here to awaken, and awaken you shall. Remember this. You were ever meant to know, but now you do. Carry it like a weapon. Speak it like a fire. Live it like a man who has stepped beyond fear. The story of Madeleine McCann will fade in headlines, but its shadow will not. Because now, in you, the forbidden flame has been lit. And no system, no institution, no manipulation can extinguish it. You are no longer who you were when this began. You are awake, and once awake, you never return.